Ready? Welcome back to The Word at Work. This is the third episode in a series on the Book of Kings. My name's Nathan Lovell. So far in this series, we've been looking mainly at Solomon and the kind of kingdom that Solomon was building. And we've got a little bit more work to do in Solomon later on, but for now we're going to switch our focus across to his major accomplishment, which was the building of the temple. As usual, you'll get more out of this talk if you've had a look at the text before we work through it together. We'll be looking at 1 Kings chapter 5 through to the end of chapter 7. Now, there's quite a bit of architectural detail in those chapters, so don't get discouraged. Have a look. It describes the temple and some of Solomon's accomplishments in building it. 1 Kings 5 to 7. Okay, there's lots of detail in these chapters today, but really there's only 3 bits to what's going on. In chapter 5, again, we get to see how wise and amazing Solomon was in the way that he gathered materials for the temple and in the way that he dealt with the foreign alliances that he needed in order to get the materials and all of those kind of things. It would follow quite well on the back of talk number 2, but we're not going to focus on it in this talk. Instead, let's look at the temple itself. The temple takes up most of chapters 6 and 7. There is a third bit to what's going on that we'll come back to. And you will have seen at the beginning of chapter 7 that Solomon built his own palaces as well. We'll come back to that. Let's look at the temple. It's probably easier for me to show you than tell you at this point. So here's an artist's rendition of what Solomon may have constructed. And you can see there some of the details from chapters 5 and 7. Number 1 on that picture, of course, is the temple itself. It's a big building. It's not absolutely enormous. It stands about 20 meters tall. Of course, it's on the top of a hill in Jerusalem. And so it wouldn't matter where you lived. You've always got to kind of walk up the hill to the temple. The temple is up from everywhere. And you can see right there, it has 2 massive pillars at the front, and they're covered with gold. They're so big that it would have taken probably 3 people or 2 large men to kind of stretch their arms around the outside of those pillars. They're plated with actual gold. They have names. One of them is named Yakin, and that means he will establish, and the other one is named Boaz, which means strength. And so as you walk in, you walk past Yakin and Boaz. God will establish in strength. And so much of the temple is about that idea. Like many religious buildings, cathedrals, and the like, the temple is highly symbolic. Everything here means something. Notice even to get into the place, you have to walk past a big bronze basin, which is labeled 3, and the altar, which is labeled 2. Before you even set foot in the place, you're reminded of the sort of God who dwells there and his demand for purity. That's why the basin of water is there. You have to wash on the way in. His demand for holiness. That's why the altar is there. You have to sacrifice for sin. You have to make atonement on the way in. When you walk inside, you might see something like this second picture. And you can see the various items that were described there in chapter 7. There's the golden lampstands that Solomon built. They're fashioned like trees. They have kind of 6 branches, 3 on either side, and the central one, those are labeled 5. There's the altar of incense there, labeled 7, which is supposed to burn smoke inside the building, of course, to kind of cover up your vision and cloud your vision and remind you that God covers this place in his own cloud. You can see the bread of the presence and the golden table that you read about. That's number 6. And you can see the curtain that separates you from the actual presence of God even once you're inside the temple. That's number 8. This outer room is called the holy place. And then beyond the curtain is called the Holy of Holies. And that's where you'll find the Ark of the Covenant. That's where you'll find 2 huge angels with wings called cherubim that guard the presence of God. And that's where, symbolically, God is enthroned in Israel. The Lord reigns, says the psalmist. Let the nations tremble. He sits enthroned between the cherubim. Let the earth shake. This is the throne room of God on earth. It's covered in gold. It's awe-inspiring. It's splendorous. And it's meant to show you the majesty of God. It's also covered in trees. I don't know if you noticed that as you read the description of the temple. The way it's decorated with carvings of pomegranates and lilies. I mean, in chapter 6, verse 29, for example, let me give you an example. He decorated all the walls of the inner sanctuary and the main room with carvings of cherubim and palm trees and open flowers. He overlaid the floor in both rooms with gold. And for the entrance to the inner sanctuary, he made double doors of wild olive wood with 5-sided doorposts that were decorated with carvings of cherubim and palm trees and open flowers. So in fact, all the way through the temple, you get these carvings and decorations of winged angels and plants. And Jachin and Boaz themselves, as we read, are crowned with lily tops so that they look like trees as you walk into the temple. It's a bit reminiscent, isn't it, of the Garden of Eden. Like the Garden of Eden that also, by the way, faced east and was guarded by cherubim and was also full of trees. It's not accidental. This temple that's been established in strength is constructed to remind us of the garden. And not just that. It reminds us of the whole problem that drives the story of the Old Testament at all. It reminds us that when God created the world, his intention was to walk in the garden and to be with his people. He placed Adam and Eve there, and he dwelt with them as their God. It reminds us that the holy, majestic, powerful God who lives in this big golden throne room, who made the world, wants to dwell with his people. And it reminds us of the sin that made that impossible. You'll remember that God banished Adam and Eve after they ate the fruit from the garden. He sent them out to the east of the garden, which is the same way the temple faces, and he placed a cherubim there with a flaming sword so that they couldn't come back and they couldn't make their way back into the presence of God. And all of those elements are here again at the temple. The temple is about two opposite things at the very same time. First, it's the presence of God in Israel. When God exiled his people from the garden, he went with them. He rescued them from Egypt. He made his tent, you'll recall, the tabernacle in the desert, and he dwelled with them. And here, as his people find a permanent place of rest from the enemies around them, he makes a permanent home as well. The story of the Old Testament is the story of a God who stubbornly intends to live and dwell with his people. But it's also the story of how that can't happen. Because God is holy. He put the cherubim up so the people couldn't come back to the garden. We disobeyed. We didn't listen to God's word. We chose to seek after other gods. We didn't live with justice. We aren't righteous people. And so the cherubim in the temple still guard the way back to God. It has a curtain that keeps us out of the presence of God. Well, not anymore, as you know, but then. It has an altar of incense, lest we catch a glimpse of God and die. You sacrifice on the way in to deal with your sin, because if you're a sinner, you can't live in the presence of that holy God. You wash. This is because at the heart of the Old Testament is this paradox that drives us to Jesus. That the holy God of the universe wants to dwell amongst us. He wants to dwell amongst us who stubbornly are determined to be gods ourselves. He wants a relationship with us, but it will kill us because we have rebelled. Now, I said we'd come back very briefly to that little passage at the beginning of chapter 7, because Solomon builds his own palace there. It's actually 3 palaces, a public one, a private one, and one for his Egyptian wife. And if you pay attention to the details, they're all bigger than the temple is. They're all covered with gold, and they're all very finely crafted, just like the temple is. 1 Kings 6:38 tells us that Solomon spent 7 years building the temple, and the very next verse in chapter 7, verse 1, but his own house, Solomon took 13 years to construct. It doesn't say it, but I wonder what it's trying to show us there, right in the middle of this splendid achievement about the God of the universe dwelling with his people. You've got Solomon building his own house that outshines the temple. And God appears to Solomon for a second time in this story and warns him, as for this temple you're building in 6:12, if you follow my decrees, observe my laws, and keep my commandments and obey them, then I will fulfill the promise that I gave to David your father, and I'll live amongst the Israelites and not abandon my people. Obedience again. This temple is a paradox. The God of the universe will come and make his home with us and dwell amongst his people. But we are a very sinful people. And the whole situation begs and reaches and cries out with an unsolvable dilemma. Now, the book of Kings doesn't know the answer. But from Solomon, it reaches out past all the kings through the rest of the book, down through the ages, until we get an answer in the New Testament. One day, God will come and pitch his tent in the flesh of Jesus Christ and dwell amongst his people, not only to be with us, but to redeem us. The curtain in the temple will tear from top to bottom, and God's dwelling place will be with man once more. Thanks for being with us today. I look forward to seeing you next time. We'll be reading 1 Kings chapter 8.